Good afternoon. I think it's like 2 minutes after midday, so it's afternoon, early, but still. Welcome at our second panel on internal and external challenges, differentiation and dominance. This part, until the end of today's day, is devoted to reviewing and summarizing and promoting results of the hard, long work that researchers and teams put into the project. And we'll have 6 research initiatives, broad research initiatives that will be presented here, 10 minutes per each presenter, which should give us at least a couple of minutes for discussion. We'll start, we have Ben Rosamond from University of Edinburgh, we have Jozef Batora from Comenius University, we have Dia Anagnostou from ELIAMEP, Cécile Peldo from Sciences Po Grenoble, Zdzisław Mach from Jagiellonian University, and Christopher Lord from University of Oslo, presenting their presentations. The presenters will need to come to this computer, which has the PowerPoints installed. It should be smoother than in the morning. With no further ado, Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magda. Hi, everybody. 10 minutes, right. Okay, so this is reporting on aspects of the bit of work package 2 that I was involved with. Jozef will be speaking to the rest of work package 2. This is research that began at the University of Copenhagen, so I've left the logo on for old time's sake, but of course I've moved. It's also worth saying that a lot of this work was done in conjunction with my colleague Rune Møller-Stæhl from Copenhagen as well. So yes, it's about democracy or dominance. So we're very much focusing on, I suppose, the democracy dominance sort of axis of the conceptual triangle that that EU3D works with. And I actually dug out the oh god, that doesn't work. I want the return. I just need the next slide. It's just something bizarre. Space. Okay, space. This is the slide that I present. One of the slides I presented at the inaugural conference in Rome. I just thought I'd go back to it to see whether the promises were fulfilled. And actually, in a way, I'm not going to talk through this diagram in any great detail, other than to say that, you know, this speaks maybe to the question that Bridget raised in the previous session about the specific effects of the crisis and whether dominance was a feature of the kind of emergency governance of the crisis, or whether there was something a bit deeper going on there. And I suppose the bit that says amplification of illicit hierarchies was actually the stimulus for us to try and think a little bit about to what extent was the governance of the Eurozone crisis during the crisis, but also in the post-crisis regime of governance that emerged later on. To what extent were these forms of domination and dominance, which have effectively been, I think, broadly understood in that sense? To what extent did these have deeper historical roots? And we took the cue here from some of the sentences in the original research proposal, basically to sort of focus on the question of dominance, but also to focus on the question of the historical context of dominance. The results of one aspect of our work, perhaps the most important, been gathered together in a special issue of Comparative European Politics, published last year. 8 papers in total. I do not have the time to do those papers justice in the short amount of space I have available to me, so I'm going to be very, very synoptic in what I say here. All I can say is, please go read that issue, read the papers, cite them, especially cite them. But effectively what we did was to sort of focus on the question of the historical context of dominance in relation to economic governance in and post-Euro crisis as the thing we were interested in looking at. So in a way, I think it's worth saying that we weren't simply bothered with tracing, if you like, the deep roots of dominance, as it were, trying to find singular points of origin where you say, aha, there's the point where this pathology of dominance begins. Although there's some of that going on, it has to be said. But I think the other thing that became clearer and clearer as we did the work and as we kind of wrote it up was that we were beginning to rethink and reconceptualize and re-understand the character of dominance and how it's exercised in the realm of economic governance within the EU. And I think this speaks to the earlier session, and particularly to Stephen's presentation of what dominance means. And as I said, we were also very keen to kind of move beyond a sort of rather decontextualized focus upon what was happening in that kind of decade or so from the onset of the euro crisis to the establishment of post-crisis governance rules. We were trying to think a little bit more deeply. So, for example, I think one of the things that we were looking at was in terms of rethinking what dominance means. One of the papers, Marino Dwyer's paper, was interested in looking at Eurozone governance in terms of exclusions, particularly gendered exclusions. Another paper by Malte Ibsen was interested in thinking to speak to something that came up in earlier discussions, using the kind of Republican kind of approach to dominance to think about the creditor-debtor relationship that was so fundamental to the way in which the Eurozone crisis operated. The papers have varying empirical foci. I won't go through all of them other than to say that they're looking at different moments historically, for the most part, ranging from the founding treaties themselves through to the emergence of fiscal rules in the context of the foundation of the European monetary system in the 1970s, still for me a very understudied period, through to the formal construction of modern EMU through the Delors Committee report, and also through the moments of Greek accession in one case. And I suppose what we weren't trying to do here was to present a rival series of explanations, but simply rather to understand and explore these different sites as moments where particular pathologies of economic governance became visible, and perhaps where some of the ways of dominance were becoming visible. If we have a model, I suppose it's driven by an interest in the politics of ideas. I have to say, from a number of disciplinary and theoretical starting points, but broadly speaking, the contributors are interested in ideas and the ways in which ideas are, in a sense, responsible for the emergence of institutional pathologies, but also taking very seriously the role, and this again came up in earlier discussions, the role of political contingency, and how political contingency, such as the debates around the European monetary system in the context of the thing Magnus Reiner studies, which is the locomotive crisis of 1977, 1978, is actually, these are the moments where some of those ideas are kind of like, are given institutional path-dependent sort of being. In terms of, so the paper by Agustín Menéndez, for example, is very, very interested in how those early discussions of what the nature of the EU's fixed exchange rate regime was going to be in the founding days of the EMS, basically showing how the kind of a law of neutral rules as expressed in the form of numbers, numerical guidelines to how an economy should be performing, became a solution to some of the political intractability of the time. And on the politics of ideas side, we were particularly interested, and this came out in a number of papers. We didn't necessarily anticipate this, but it came out in a number of papers, that one of the things that's going on are the ways in which particular paradoxes and particular trajectories of liberal thought are actually being articulated to aspects of European economic governance. Maybe just a few words on those. So there's the interest here, as I said, is in how those currents in liberal thinking, some of them going back a very, very long way into the 1700s, how they're put to work in in economic governance in the EU context, and how they are put to work in the service, if you like, of dominance. And three papers, I think, kind of really drew this out. Charles Krarup looked at did a kind of analysis of the concept of the market, how it kind of features in the founding treaties of the European Economic Community. And effectively what he argues is that there's a basic conceptual indeterminacy in the idea of the market that effectively requires there to be an extra legal kind of determination from without of what the market means, which effectively allows for particular types of domination to take place. And the paper I wrote with Rune, we were very interested in the concept of non-majoritarianism, namely the idea that certain sorts of decisions need to be delegated outside of the realm of regular democratic politics, and the ways in which those then became articulated to particular ideas of the economy. So one of the paradoxes that we kind of explore, looking at the ways in which not only modern neoliberalism, but also post-war ideas of militant democracy, and ideas going further back into the sort of Madisonian kind of way of thinking, how these actually perversely move from seeking to protect democracy from kind of plebiscitary and kind of populist mob rule, protections against the tyranny of the majority become protections of the market from democracy. And one of the really interesting ways in which we can think about dominance being exercised through what we might call coercive depoliticization, taking it out of the arena of politics in order to allow forms of dominance to take place. And then back to Agustín Menéndez's paper, his interest in numerical rules. I mean, again, looking at the liberal hope to achieve a kind of form of neutral government, to a situation where economic government is captured by particular types of economic knowledge, which are then expressed through numerical rules which have these kind of structuring dominance effects. This is the interesting paradox that he ends up kind of identifying, is that numerical rules, such as the fiscal rules, which have their origins in the EMS and then are fed through into the Maastricht Treaty and beyond, are effectively not extra discretionary. They're actually giving space for discretion. They're not neutral arbitrators. They're actually giving space for discretion. Just to kind of, I don't know, yeah, well, there you go. Just to kind of finish off with conclusions, I think the first conclusion I would come to, and I said this to John Eric this morning as we were walking over, that this is unfinished business. There's much more work to be done. I mean, I just think there is some very, very good historical work done on European economic integration, but it's kind of a niche kind of activity that there's a few people who do the work really interestingly and really well, and maybe not enough people read it, but I think mainstreaming this kind of analysis actually gives us a real insight. And I think one of the insights, secondly, that really came to me was the articulation of the conceptual vocabulary that EU3D has with kind of critical political economy researchers. And I think we found it quite easy and quite an interesting space to explore as we conducted the work. As I've already said, I think it's, one of the interesting things is the feedback loop, where by talking about the origins of dominance, we're able to understand dominance more effectively and more maybe with a wider scope. And very finally, and just an advertisement really, that a paper that I circulated into the shared folder for the group, a paper that Rune and I have drafted, and it's very drafty, trying to understand how we rethink the idea of the democratic deficit in light of the kinds of findings that this bit of the work package has come up with. That was one of the bits of Dario that was very interesting that we were able to hear, was the point about whether democratic deficit is a useful way of framing the kind of democratic issues that face the European Union. I mean, from our point of view, the interesting question is, to what extent is the democratic deficit something that we need to understand in relation to some of these sort of inbuilt pathologies of economic governance within the EU? And I think I better stop there. Thank you very much.
The next person is Jozef Batora, as I said, from Comenius University, continuing this topic, and in the meantime, multitasking. I'll switch to presentation.
Great, thank you. All right, so what we did in our part of the work on the project was the following. I want to start with with the task that we were assigned. In fact, in 2019, as we were hashing this out, and there were three things that we talked about. That is, we were going to assess the fragmentation hypothesis in this project. Was one of the overall hypotheses. And the idea there was that these crises that we have experienced, in this case in 2019, the good old days, just the financial crisis and just the euro and just the migration crisis, refugee crisis, but also the emergent geopolitical crisis in Russia following their marching into Crimea and eastern Ukraine. That this has indeed had differentiating, generated differentiating shocks for the EU. What did we mean by a differentiating shock? Well, this is a sort of a shock, and this is a concept that Jozef has elaborated on in a book that I'll talk about in a minute. It's a shock that shakes the political system in a manner that leads to further differentiation and also leads to the rise of dominant issues and strengthening on certain actors and systematic weakening of others. And then a question we raised, of course, there is to what extent and how dominance might be also a consequence of these differentiating shocks and reactions to those. Now, as I said, these were the good old days of, again, just the refugee crisis and just the financial crisis. After we hashed this out, as you know, and Jozef just mentioned it, we were chasing crises. Afterwards, which of course was the COVID-19, and then indeed the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and that of course had to be covered in the project. So we had to adapt as we were going. So what do we mean by this relationship? How do we explore this relationship between differentiation and dominance in the EU? Now we're starting with the concept of Poly-Crises, of course, and we are thinking about those as having structural and affecting institutional mutations, leading to institutional mutations in the European Union. Conceptually, we depart from these mainstream conceptualizations of differentiated integration, and of course we are on slippery ground here because several of you have made fundamental contributions to the discussion of differentiated integration. But we argue that, in fact, in what we say in the book that I'll talk about in a minute is, in fact, that differentiation is indeed a structural feature also of the European Union, and it has institutional effects. So it's an dominance in these structural features could also be an inherent feature there. What exactly do we mean by dominance? Again, there are others in the room who have done more on this, but this is quite an encompassing way of thinking. More in general, dominance would be having power over somebody. This is the old Roman definition of dominus. That's where the etymology comes from, right? And that is the lord over a slave, right? Now, in this case, we would, of course, see various forms of domination. It would be, arbitrariness, illicit rule, lack of transparency, submission to unaccountable hierarchy and technocracy, exclusion, denial of recognition, and, of course, all kinds of status and rights deprivations. And we have explored various aspects of this in the case studies and in the different chapters in a book that we have done. So this is then one of the outcomes of our work package, which is an edited volume that we have done together with Jozef as editors and with the contributions of many of you who are in the room right now. the key concepts that are introduced there, and again, this is John Eric speaking. Me speaking on behalf of John Eric, would be, differentiation configuration, and then, of course, differentiating shocks. The idea, of course, would be that there is an institutional configuration in the EU, that the EU is specifically differentiated, that this is indeed a specific type of differentiation that we find in the European Union compared to other kinds of differentiation which are normal in political systems, from the Durkheimian point of view. Differentiating shocks we already defined. The point that we make is that, in fact, in reaction to the crises, the different kinds of crises, those have strengthened. The question we raise: did they really strengthen the EU, or did they, in fact, strengthen certain EU institutions? As you will see in some of the case studies in the book, we will see that, for instance, the European Commission got quite strengthened by the COVID-19 crisis, because of its competencies and its new institutional structures that were set up to manage the crisis in relation to member states. But also what we have seen as part of the process was the creation of what we would term interstitial bodies. These would be bodies emerging between different institutional domains in situations when established institutions fail to deliver on what they're supposed to deliver. So in those cases, the EU is actually a very flexible system, turns out, to establish, interstitial bodies, which draw upon resources, personnel, legal, structural resources of other institutions from different domains, recombine those into new patterns and stabilized practices. That is, of course, the European Stability Mechanism, which, as you know, is an international organization established outside of the treaties to deal with the Eurozone crisis. It is the European Border and Coast Guard, which is not just a border and coast guard, doesn't just operate on the borders, but of course operates outside of the European Union in third countries, but also inside of the European Union in policing. And of course, a quintessential case will be the External Action Service of the European Union. I wrote about this 10 years ago in a study which, of course, recombining practices and norms and rules from diplomacy, defense, intelligence, development aid under the same roof of the same organization. So the point is that there's a structural constraint to the European Union. It's not a state. But because it's not a state, because of these structural and political and legal constraints, it can actually do more than states often can do. It's a kind of a paradox, right? Constraints leading to more flexibility. And that's what we have also found in a number of these cases as to how the European Union has actually developed. And this is what also has led to these structural mutations of the European Union. So here is an outline of the chapters. I will try to go through those, if you don't mind, very quickly. So we had a chapter by Simona Piattoni and Ton Notermans on the problems of domination in the Eurozone in connection with the main relevant crises, the Eurozone crisis and the COVID-19 crisis. Then there was a chapter written by me on the recovery and resilience facility in Slovakia and new forms of intra-European conditionality emerging, various kinds of mechanisms that were introduced as part of the process. Those, of course, also include various kinds of dominance in relation to the member states and their economies and societies. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested, or bilaterally. Ingrid Jettaker and Ben Sofus-Stranoy, they have provided a chapter on the European Central Bank's handling of the Eurozone and COVID-19 crisis and connected dominance effects. Filipa Hatzistavru, she worked on a chapter on the interaction of dominance and differentiation with explicit focus on Greece in the context of the Eurozone crisis. Dia Anagnostou has worked on the 2015-2016 migration crisis and the EU's asylum system and how it operates in terms of unequally allocating the responsibilities for asylum, which leads to dominance with disintegration effects. Espen Olsen from Arena has worked on how supranational policies and responses to the crisis have led to a differentiation of personnel status of refugees within the EU. And it goes on. This is a long book. We've been chasing crises. It's been expanding, but I think it's also important in covering various aspects of the questions that we raised. Martin Mouland and Asimina Michailidou have worked on the Eurozone and COVID-19 crisis, and to what extent these have fostered differentiation, understood as consolidation of the European public sphere. And they were focusing on Twitter discourses in Germany and Greece, including dominance, frames. This was actually a great chapter, giving a lot of headache to our editor, because there was lots of data on the Twitter posts. Elodie Thévenin, she analyzed the Polish parliamentary debates on the role and status of migrants in 3 crises. As you know, Poland has experienced 3 of them since 2015. So the migration crisis 2015, the 2021 EU-Belarus border crisis, and then the Russia, of course, war on Ukraine and the ensuing movement of people into Europe, into the EU. And she was focusing on the dominance frames associated with the labeling of migrants and the role of government. William Ostatnik from Comenius University, he has focused on Russia's annexation of Crimea 2014 and the question to what extent this has led to fragmentation in the EU's foreign policy making. What is interesting, he identifies mechanisms such as constructive abstention, which have allowed for unified, maintenance of unified reactions to this, and in that way also differentiated integration actually was preventing domination. So countries that didn't agree could, actively abstain. Cécile Pellaudet, she has focused on vulnerability in relation to the growing influence of China in Europe and the form of influence that it may foster in terms of fragmentation and democratic weakening. We of course have 3 more chapters, and that is first a chapter by Sergio Fabrini, who was comparing the sovereign debt crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. And he focused on discerning the dominance implications of a form of EU differentiation. While in the sovereign debt crisis, unconstrained intergovernmentalism would be the name of the game. In the case of COVID-19, there was a shift toward constrained supranationalism. In chapter 15, Max Herrmann and Dirk Leuven investigate how the public views a democratically deleterious form of differentiation, namely rule of law backsliding in Poland and Hungary. The main finding of that chapter is that EU citizens are actually willing to sanction norm-violating member states. And then we also have conclusions there. So what would be the conclusions in very short last slide? Now, the EU's specific differentiation configuration has a dual effect, we argue. On the one hand, it enables joint action, effective joint action in specific policy areas. At the same time, though, it leads to various forms of dominance, that is, illicit hierarchies, various types of exclusion, and internally and externally. Now, the question we need to ask, of course, and this raises for us, in a time of existential threat for the EU, thinking about, of course, the threat from the external environment, that is the authoritarian challenge by Russia and China, but also in a time of internal challenges to our democracies, that's the authoritarian challenge by the EU's own populists. How ready is the Union to really withstand these, given these capabilities? On the one hand, the ability to effectively address crises with new sorts of structural mutations, but at the same time, various kinds of dominance that is inherent to those structural mutations. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Dia and Anagnostou. At the moment, we are moving with presentations to relations with external actors, and Dia will talk about the enlargement.
Yes, countering dominance, enhancing legitimacy, the unhopeful saga of EU enlargement in the Western Balkans, a little bit of a grim title, but so I will speak. I will talk about EU external relations, as Magda mentioned, and specifically focus on EU enlargement in the Western Balkans. That's one of the studies that we did, apart from EU neighborhood policy. The Western Balkans is a region that, of course, geographically and historically are part of Europe. Enlargement in the region, it was inaugurated in 2003, so nearly 20 years ago, but with the exception of Croatia that joined the European Union in 2013, for the rest of the countries, the prospect of accession is rather remote, in spite of occasional high-level statements of EU officials that it's about to restart. So what interested me is that despite accession-related reform, that transposing the EU acquis, particularly in the area of of rule of law, the region has seen either a stagnation of democratization, or in some countries, a deterioration of democracy during this period. So to explore this kind of contradiction, I have applied the concept of dominance. We've been talking about this in this context of EU accession in the Western Balkans. I think this concept has a lot of currency. There is a lot that has been written to understand, of course, this contradiction. But I think the concept of dominance has a lot of currency in this case. We have understood it in terms of EU external relations. We have understood the potential of dominance to arise from a situation of power asymmetry in which states with various forms of association with the EU are subject to EU rules, but do not participate in deciding these rules. So, for example, we've looked at the EEA states in this regard. This kind of situation can create, doesn't necessarily, but it can create a legitimacy deficit. So in the context of EU enlargement, too, conditionality policy embodies this kind of asymmetry, of course, par excellence. It is self-incurred asymmetry. Candidate states agree to transpose laws to pursue reforms towards democracy in return for eventual membership. So I argue in this brief presentation that specific characteristics of enlargement in the Western Balkans have entrenched this asymmetry, this asymmetrical relationship into a structural condition of dominance. And this has progressively eroded EU legitimacy in the region, including in states that have been considered front runners in this process, like Serbia and Montenegro. So let me explain this a little bit in the limited time that I have. There are two characteristics of conditionality policy in the Western Balkans which are of relevance here. First of all, an enormous body of laws that have to be transposed by candidate states. And not only that was the case also in previous waves of enlargement, but in the case of the Western Balkans, we have this idea of democracy first. So these must be transposed prior to accession. They must be completed before other chapters open up. So, and the second characteristic is the so-called the Copenhagen Plus idea. So besides the Copenhagen conditions, there are additional requirements that candidate states in the region must fulfill, which touch upon highly sensitive national issues in a region that in the 1990s saw bitter ethnic conflicts and contested statehood. For example, full cooperation. One condition is full cooperation with International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia, which was very relevant in the case of Serbia. And the second condition, normalization of relations with Kosovo, a region formerly a region of Serbia that declared its independence in 2008. So Serbia begrudgingly complied with both, including the normalizing its relations with Kosovo in order to acquire candidate status in 2014. I analyze all of this in a study that I have done, but a particularly difficult issue for Serbia. So all of this is just to say that we have extremely demanding, externally imposed accession conditions with very limited reciprocity in the short and medium term that also interfere with statehood and sensitive national issues. Altogether, I have argued that they foster perceptions, widely held perceptions among society of the EU as imposing arbitrary and double standards and interfering with national sovereignty. And being the EU being an arbitrary external someone who imposes rules. So the EU has sought, of course, this is has been a problem. The EU has sought to counter this mostly by including civil society in the accession process. It has done a lot of things in this regard. It has done a lot of capacity building for civil society organizations. And in fact, this formal process of accession has seen an unprecedented mobilization of civil society in comparison to earlier waves of enlargement. But the result of this has not been what it was hoped for. There has not been any decentralization of the process or any broader societal participation in this process. And I try to explain this. One important reason is that in spite of all these efforts of the EU, you continue to put a premium on geopolitical considerations and regional stability and putting this ahead of rule of law, human rights, compliance, and democracy. So it changed in a way the nature of conditionality as rule promoting and rule adhering process. For example, Serbia became a candidate state in 2014, never mind that it has been characterized as one of the fastest autocratizing states. Also, the EU has tolerated or supported authoritarian leaders and governments in the region, who present themselves as EU supporters and as guarantors of regional stability. This is, in the literature, it has been coined as stabilitocracy. So leaders who otherwise have worked to establish total control of the political system, have cooperated with private interests to capture the state, and basically who are non-democratic but who enjoy external legitimacy. So what we've seen is stronger centralization of the political system, exclusion of civil society, and erosion of democratic freedoms. And here I have this quote from Ursula von der Leyen, which was repeatedly invoked by some of the people I interviewed, who is as an example of how far from reality official EU statements seem to be. So to sum this up and close this brief presentation, what we have here is the increasing dissociation of the EU accession process from democracy and rule of law conditionality, the lack of reciprocity in short and medium term. All of these have entrenched dominance as a structural condition. Indeed, they have reinforced a kind of double dominance, so between the EU and candidate states and domestically between leaders, non-democratic leaders and the citizens, which has undermined motivation for democratic reforms, and most importantly, the credibility of the EU as a force of of democratization in the region. And most striking is that this perception has even taken hold among the EU supporters, the strongest EU supporters in the region who who have been disillusioned. I think I need less than 1 minute. You can say it has killed the prospect. This condition of entrenched dominance has killed the prospect of full membership, for the time being at least. In the light of this, various alternatives to full membership and schemes of differentiated integration are now put forth as a way to go. But I don't have time to talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for keeping the time, Dia. And I would like to invite Cécile Palladeux. And we're moving a little bit further out because Cécile will talk about China. Not all of it, but yes. I'm just doing it.
Okay, thank you very much. This presentation relates to the work done by the Work Package 3, and it contributes to EU3D with an external perspective on differentiation. It analyzes the effects of differentiation on resilience to the influence of an external power. More specifically, the research question addressed is how and why differentiated organizations strengthen or not their resilience and strategic autonomy in relation to China's influence, and how does differentiation play out in that process. So the question matters considering the global agenda of China, its illiberal character, and its impact not only on states but also on regional organizations. EU, ASEAN and Mercosur are selected as they display variation in institutional design, while the influence of China manifests itself with similar patterns in matter of trade and security. China is, since 2020, the first trading partner of all regional organizations. The time frame is from 2013, the year of the launching of the Belt and Road Initiative, until 2022. Oops. So the conceptual framework relies on the classic definition between vertical, internal, and external differentiation. One contribution is to refine the distinction between external differentiation and external cooperation, which was blurred in existing studies on comparative differentiation, and which gave a biased analysis of the extent of differentiation. So external differentiation is defined as a process through which a third country either adopts a regional organization law or aligns its law with the regional's primary or secondary law. External cooperation does not require this condition. With regard to the effects, resilience is defined as the capacity to adapt, respond, react, and bounce back in the aftermath of shocks and crises, while strategic autonomy implies, in addition, the capacity to act autonomously in cooperation with like-minded partners. So the hypotheses mobilize integration and international relation theory. The first hypothesis proposes that strengthening differentiation is a suitable option for increasing resilience. The second hypothesis proposes that a regional organization can increase its resilience with developing external cooperation with influential states, while the third hypothesis, cooperating with China, represents the least favorable option from the perspective of strategic autonomy. There are more specific specifications regarding hypothesis 1, which we can go into later if we have time. Regarding the method, it has consisted first, it's a qualitative design, and it has consisted first in mapping and measuring differentiation and external cooperation with sources including legal database from the 3 regional organizations, and we have interviews, literature statistics. We have produced a database with 51 instruments. The measurement of differentiation relies on Leufen's and Orr's method, while external cooperation is measured with the analysis of the number of instruments, the scope, and the states involved. Assessing resilience and strategic autonomy is made according to a 4-level scale. So, in terms of results, mapping H1 versus external cooperation, we see that the 3 regional organizations have distinct strategies. The blue color shows the share of external partnerships in relation to the total number of instruments. The orange color shows the share of intergovernmental instruments, while the gray color, the share of supranational integration. So the research shows that the EU relies more on differentiation, orange and gray, than on external cooperation compared to ASEAN, and it has a high share of supranational integration. ASEAN has a high dependence on external cooperation at 85%, while Mercosur has established few instruments and external including these instruments is the EU-Mercosur agreement. The results regarding the 2 external hypotheses, the share of external cooperation between a regional organization and China alone on the graph is in orange. So we see that there's a low level of institutional cooperation between the EU and China, and it reflects a shift in the relation with China since 2019. ASEAN, on the contrary, relies to a great extent on cooperation with China to ensure economic resilience. ASEAN actually specific regional architecture in relation to an embedded China in the ASEAN architecture results in fostering substantial vulnerabilities in terms of strategic autonomy. With regard to Mercosur, actually the cooperation with China is unlikely to happen given the fact that Paraguay has recognized Taiwan. Mapping internal differentiation and external differentiation, we see that the EU has an extensive use of external differentiation. It's the only regional organization to have constraining rules governing the relation with third states. The EU is in a position to negotiate conditionalities. In contrast with existing literature, ASEAN does not resort to external differentiation. This situation can be explained by the difference in legalization between the EU and ASEAN, and also by the difference in power relations between the regional organization and their associated and partner countries. Although the EU's relation with candidate countries and neighborhood countries are oriented towards supporting development, ASEAN's relation with external partners are structured around the premise of the partner's capacity to support ASEAN's development, both in terms of resources and expertise. And Mercosur has only one instrument relevant with regard to internal and external differentiation. So what can we deduce from these results? The EU has an extensive use of external differentiation. Its resilience is assessed as strong and its strategic autonomy as medium. ASEAN uses internal differentiation for cohesion mechanism and does not use external differentiation. Instead, ASEAN develops external cooperation to a great extent, half of which with China. Its resilience is assessed as medium, and ASEAN has no strategic autonomy. ASEAN is referring to the concept of centrality. And this concept is defined by ASEAN stakeholders as being a driving force, as ASEAN being a driving force for regional cooperation. It's the motto of ASEAN regionalism, but it appears incompatible with the ASEAN way, which emphasizes informality, consensus, non-interference in the other states' policies. So while the ASEAN way was critical in socializing China, it has also institutionalized the means by which China can stall and forestall the development of other norms that would entail more sustained restraint, transparency, and less control from Beijing. Mercosur has fewer instruments, which can be explained by three factors. First, Chinese influence appears to be so far of a lesser magnitude, and Mercosur is sensitive to political shifts. There's been a huge shift between the first Lula's presidency and Bolsonaro's presidency, which has favored a nationalistic understanding of autonomy and acting as a subordinate to the Trump's administration. So to conclude, differentiation is not significant outside the European Union in the areas under scrutiny, which is important to mention. The EU, we observe the expansion of a centralized, differentiated regionalism. There is both an increase in supranational integrated instruments and an extension of external differentiation in trade and security policies. But we also observe at the same time the development of an informal differentiated cooperation as exemplified by the European political community. ASEAN can be described as an encircled regionalism, whereas it used to be defined as a concentric circle. This encircled regionalism relies on external cooperation and results in a fragile balance that depends on the opposing interest of great and middle-sized powers. Mercosur has been dormant for some years, but could be revitalized in the overlapping regionalism characterizing South America's regionalism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cecile, for keeping the time. And I would like to invite Professor Jozef who will present a paper on instrumental and autotelic legitimization of dominance based on Polish case.
Ja mam ją otwartą u siebie, więc ona działa. Czekaj. To. Co nie trzeba. Tak. Okay. Nie ma tak. Nie ma tak dobrze. Musi się działać.
Okay, thank you very much. After all, it does work, surprisingly. Well, this is what I'm going to present is based on research carried out by, in fact, 3 people. Joanna Żachowska, who is not here yet. She would come tomorrow. She's traveling from the United States, I believe. She should be really presenting it, but I will try to do it as well. There was myself, and there was Kinga Sekerde, our postdoctoral researcher. And the title, as you can see, is Does Dominance Defy Democracy Between Instrumental Autocratic Legitimation of Dominance, the case of Poland. This is really, we went back to the period of accession negotiation in Poland, which was a long period and characterized obviously by asymmetry between Poland and the EU. Poland was applying for membership, and of course the EU set the conditions. We heard just a few minutes ago a very interesting story about the Western Balkans, so that's not in no way different. But the question is, in this obvious case of asymmetry, is it really dominance, and how it was perceived by people who were democratically elected representatives of society, the members of the Polish parliament, and how such asymmetry, could it be justified, and if so, how it was justified. Maybe I just so as it says here, the voluntary because we see this process of negotiation concluded by the referendum as kind of a voluntary submission to EU rules, and we can say it is a form of dominance, and if so, how it can be justified. We see dominance as a process, as kind of process rather than as fixed, stable power structure, a kind of structuration, structure in the making. And here the legitimation of this process, of course, is essential. Can dominance be legitimized, and what are the conditions which allow for dominance to be accepted, and when then and under what conditions dominance is rejected, dominance is refused as a type of relations. To find out, to solve this question, at least partially, we analyzed 24 parliamentary debates on European integration in Poland between the years 1991 and 2004. So there are 4 parliamentary terms. It's a long period. We came to conclusions, findings which I want to present now very briefly. There were, of course, different narratives of dominance with different types of moral, but even more so pragmatic justifications. The whole process of accession and also negotiation of accession, which took many years, can be seen as a process of modernization. This is really what always has to be remembered when we think about the enlargement of 2004 and later, when former communist-dominated countries negotiated their accession. There was a modernization project. It was not so much a calculation of pros and cons and gains and losses, but the idea that there is really no alternative, and that the modernization is absolutely fundamentally needed and absolutely necessary. Therefore, that's really not much of a debate whether it makes sense or not, whether this accession should be the aim of the country. But in most cases, the legitimation was based on a few basic ideas, a few basic concepts. The most important one was security. It was always really mentioned, in those debates. The proximity of Russia and the fresh memory of Russian domination was led to the concept that for the country to be secure, for the region to be secure, membership in Western structures, especially NATO, but also the European Union, was a necessary condition. Then, of course, prosperity. But security, prosperity, of course, came first. That was most frequently mentioned, most frequently discussed. But also something else, and the something else was a kind of power. In other words, the idea that the country, once in the European structures, in the EU, would be more powerful in a way, within this structure of the European Union, more, stronger participating in decision-making processes. The alternative would be marginalization, would be the position of a small country between big powers, but being in the structures would, of course, allow Poland to become relatively much more powerful than before. There was also the case. What was also mentioned was the possibility to become a regional leader in the region of Central Europe. Poland is the biggest country, so this position that Poland must be in the European Union and must be in NATO, but this would also allow them to play a role of a local leader. What was mentioned as the justification of the negative position towards accession, the rejection of it, was the following: the issue of sovereignty. Already then, now of course it's much more important in this than the possibility of becoming a second-class member. And this is a kind of a pride and dignity that maybe it's better to be outside of the structure than be inside, but as a second-class, second-rate member. There was also, especially on the side of a more nationalistic side of the Polish parliament, the threat of German domination. The European Union is often presented, was then and still is, as a German empire, the German-dominated community. Therefore, it was not so much a dominance of the European Union as a dominance of Germany, which of course appealed to nationalistic sentiments and memory. Also, not very significant, but existing concept was also that the European Union is an elite project, and therefore it is not a good idea for a sovereign and proud nation to be ruled by an elite, whatever kind of elite it might be. So that's kind of like a populist argument, which today, if I may say so now, grew to one of the leading arguments, that in the populist concept of the people against the elites, the European Union represents the immoral and corrupt elites. But there was also another thing which I think is worth mentioning, namely that an important part of justification of pro-EU sentiment was the idea that there is such a thing as a common family of values, that the European Union represents this community of values, and Poland shares this membership in this community of values that justifies applying of institutional membership, that there are the same values which are shared by the EU, but of course this then throws a different light on the question of dominance, because it's like being in one family of values. So if the candidate country is dominated, it's not dominated by some others, it's not dominated by some strangers, by somebody who is outside of the community, who is a stronger outsider, but it is being in a community, and of course there are more mature members or less mature members, but these less mature members of the community, when they catch up with those more mature, then then the relation is going to change, and the situation of dominance would no longer exist, because like in the family, the younger members of course are dominated by the older members, but the older members dominate, but not forever. But this is like a temporary situation of dominance. There's also an important question of trust, that within such a community of values we trust each other, and then the European community should be trusted not because of some rational calculation, but because simply of being the community of values. There's trust based on the perception of the community of values. There's also one more thing which I think is worth mentioning, and this is the argument in favor of accepting dominance, is that this is a democratic decision, that first of all, democracy will be better established in once the country is part of the European Union, but also that citizens and their representatives have the right to democratically decide to negotiate for membership, and if they accept dominance, it is democratically accepted. That this is maybe dominance, but this is democratically chosen. Therefore, there is no really conflict between democracy and it. And then we spoke about two forms of dominance. One is instrumental, it is based on the modernization project. Another is autotelic, which is based on the belief that there is a community of values, so Europe stands for these values and therefore is good for what it is, and not only whether it is good for us. And for more results, there is the paper which we drafted, and of course it is accessible on the website, so if you are interested, you're welcome to refer to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mach, and I would like to give floor to Chris Lord to conclude the presentations with the topic that was important for this project of Brexit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No PowerPoint. This doesn't work with PowerPoint. Believe me, I've tried it. Yes, thank you, Magda. My topic for EU3D is Brexit and limits on the relations that the European Union can offer to non-members. Now, the law of no cherry-picking, might seem absolutely obvious, but exactly why it is so important to exclude from benefits those who do not contribute to their costs has perhaps not been fully thought through. I want to sketch a theory of the right to exclude. Indeed, I identify a number of interconnected rights. The right to exclude, the right to pool sovereignty, and the right to exit. Without being able to manage externalities between themselves, member state democracies will find it hard to meet their own obligations to their own publics, to secure rights, justice, non-domination, and the standards of democracy itself. Likewise, their citizens will find it difficult to do what is most defining of a democracy, namely to accord one another rights and control their own laws as equals. Without being able to manage externalities between themselves, it will be difficult for citizens to use their own democracies to accord one another rights and to control their own laws. That's the argument I'm going to try to make. Closely interconnected democracies will find it hard to provide themselves with rights where polluters, monopolists, tax evaders, discriminators, slanderers are located in other jurisdictions. Nor will they find it easy, nor will citizens of national democracies find it easy to provide themselves with justice, defined in Rawlsian terms as how well institutions, laws, and opportunities all hang together as a more or less fair scheme of cooperation. Many of the opportunities and laws that determine whether any one democracy is a fair scheme of cooperation are deeply affected by externalities between democracies. Without managing externalities between themselves, national democracies may likewise become a source of democracy on democracy domination. If any one national democracy has an interest in imposing harms on its neighbours, or in free riding on the efforts of others to provide the positive externalities of shared economic, ecological, and security systems, if any one democracy has an interest in doing those things, then the chances are its own voters and its own parliament will also have an interest in behaving in those wicked ways. For sure. Okay, for sure. Closely interconnected democracies may be able to get quite a long way towards managing externalities by just cooperating and bargaining between themselves without much in the way of shared norms, shared institutions, or shared authority. Contrary to the view that bargaining is just strategic, it's just for bastards. Contrary to the view that bargaining is just strategic and without any normative value, bargaining over the management of interdemocracy externalities can itself have the special normative quality of allowing each democracy to cooperate according to its own conceptions of what is good and what is right. Acting together whilst deciding norms and values apart may be especially appealing also in the case of cooperation between democracies. After all, as the European Union itself illustrates, conditions for democracy, such as political competition, high levels of voter participation, a well-founded, a well-formed public sphere, and political community, all those conditions seem a whole lot easier to achieve within states, within democracies, than between them. But the problem is obvious. The problem in just leaving everything to bargaining between democracies is obvious. Bargaining will follow power. The obvious question is whether a bargain, based on some distribution of power between democracies, can have much resemblance, either as process or as outcome, to what is required for democracies to meet their own obligations to their own publics, or for their citizens to meet their own obligations to their own co-citizens. That's the problem. That's the problem. Publics may feel that some collective goods and some externalities are of such fundamental importance that they should be provided or avoided as a matter of right and not as a matter of bargaining. Instead of leaving things to bargaining, national democracies might get far closer. They might get far closer to meeting their own obligations to their own publics by developing shared rights and obligations with other democracies over the management of externalities. But the problem is this. Groups of democracies will struggle to do that. They will find it difficult to do that if they cannot exclude outsiders from imposing negative externalities or from free riding on the efforts of insiders to provide positive externalities. They need to be able to exclude. If democracies have a right to associate, to manage externalities in ways needed for their own citizens, or for the citizens of each cooperating democracy to use their own national democracies, to accord one another rights, and to control their own laws as equals, they must also have a right to exclude from their shared policies, laws, and institutions any behaviours of non-members that would subvert their own agreed ways of managing externalities between themselves. So the right to exclude follows from the right to associate. An important example is access of non-members to the single market. The single market is at once the creation of the European Union's constitutional principles, a bundle of rights, and a set of club goods and public goods that can only be provided collectively or not at all. It's all three of those things at once. And it has to be all of those things if the single market is to function as an ambitious form of shared lawmaking that is able to remove non-tariff barriers and behind-border restrictions to trade. But the positive externality of a shared single market would be fragile if the EU was to create a form of non-membership that allowed some to enjoy the club goods without also accepting the unwelcome constitutional principles and decision rules. Also fragile would be any rights that all non-members agree their citizens need to accord one another as part of a single market. If members have a right to exclude, that follows from a need to manage externalities between themselves. Sovereignty pooling may then have to be something highly interconnected democracies will need to consider if, in Philip Pettit's terms, they are to order themselves internationally, they are able to ensure that they are ordered internationally in ways that also ensure their internal autonomy. That's the challenge, very interesting challenge for democracies to make sure that they are ordered internationally in ways that also ensure their internal autonomy. Finally, if democracies have a right, perhaps even a duty, to manage externalities between themselves in ways that allow their citizens to accord one another rights and control their own laws as equals, those democracies presumably also have a right to leave the European Union if they can find some better way of managing externalities between themselves. So member states have a right to pool sovereignty, they have a right to exclude, and they have a right to exit. Those three rights interconnect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. Thank you very much, all panelists, for contributing in presentation of the massive research that has been done in this project for 4 years. So this is just a sneak peek into what we've done. I would like to open the floor for questions. Please raise your hands and take a microphone. We have two in the front, and I have one. So please, anyone wants to ask a question? Sergio? Bring it. Yes, wyżej, tam do... Oh, thank you. Karolina, weź drugi. I think we'll maybe collect 2 to 3 questions and then give the floor to the presenters and do another round for another round of questions. So Sergio,
thanks very much. It was an interesting panel. Just, I would like to make a few points. And the first one is a general point. Do we risk to transform differentiation in a sort of conceptual stretching that says different things to different people for different subjects and so forth? So I have this fear that we are really sleeping in a sort of conceptual stretching where we speak, let's say, different languages, thinking of looking at the same subject. The second question was raised by the presentation. Are we sure that to pose some conditionality for entry to the European Union is a form of domination, and is not domination a relation related to a kind of possibility for those who are asking to enter not to enter, where domination is a relational concept, where exit is excluded and voice is the only possibility that you have. So is it, why do we use domination for imposing I follow Chris' conclusion? Why we use domination for discussing this kind of relation? And moreover, especially empirically, we know that once you are in, it is absolutely difficult to guarantee what Chris said, that you respect the rule of the game. Probably it's better for us to change the vocabulary and not use domination for dealing with enlargement, but using other different concepts.
Thank you very much. Jon Erik.
Thanks very much. We started out with a hypothesis in the project on self-imposed hegemony, and we were doing that on Norway, because there you have a democratic decision not to be a member and still to be to submit oneself under a system of binding cooperation. So it's an interesting twist in that sense. To what extent does the EU constitute? Does this constitute the system of domination when it is voluntary and when the EU is inclusive and allowing for participation in programs without Norway having any say, which it has itself determined democratically? I don't think this constitutes domination on the EU's part. And it comes to Chris, the question is, should Norway have voting rights without being a member? I know your answer is clear, and so is mine. I would say no. And it's interesting with the current situation that the EU is so inclusive in allowing for non-members to be full participants of the internal market. And I would say that this is a circumstance because the EU is ambiguous in its own constitutional status. If the EU moved towards decentralization, fragmentation, then this would disappear and there would be a fight of all states against all. Or if it consolidated further, then this would also disappear because the logic that Chris comes up with would be. So there is a very distinctive situation now, I would think. I mean, I just would like your reflections on this, but my other question is to the whole panels. And I think I follow up on Sergio on this, namely, are we sometimes seeing dilemmas or trade-offs? For instance, in Dia's situation, wasn't there a dilemma for the EU there in terms of, on the one hand, to stabilize the conditions, and on the other hand, also to try to impose democratic conditions? How easy is it to do so? And I think it might be useful for us to highlight these as dilemmas. And the other thing that I also would like the panel to reflect on is unintended effects of actions. Something that we are discussing as domination can often be unintended effects. And that goes back to the audiential notion of domination, that the problems of that, what we are actually detecting as something about domination, certainly might not have been intended as that, and certainly have very other types of effects. Like, for instance, the EU's relationship to non-members is an attempt to be inclusive of democracies without actually imposing the same type of obligations on them. Now, that is not an intention of domination. That is a form of inclusion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. One more question, and I will give the Bridget Laffin.
Thank you. If I could follow up what Sergio said about enlargement, because I think firstly, the modernization impulse started way before the 2004 enlargement. There were many other small, poor countries joined the EU before then. And I think if the EU was intent on domination, then it simply wouldn't have enlarged at all to all of the poorer countries that have joined. It's been extraordinarily open to countries whose levels of economic development and institutional development was much weaker than the original core on the Rhine. So I think we need, inevitably, enlargement is asymmetrical because it is one country negotiating with a large entity. And by definition, you're very weak when you want to join a club because the club sets the terms of engagement. But I think it would be extraordinary if the EU decided to co-create a new EU with countries wanting to come in. And in the history of integration, only one country thought it could do that, and it failed dismally, and that was the United Kingdom. It actually thought in the early 60s that there would be much more openness to influence the nature of the EU itself on the way in. No country gets to do it. No country has got to do it. But this is an entity that has proven to be very open to enlarging its borders. So I think we need to be, I think there's a danger that not only are we potentially stretching concepts in terms of differentiation, but also domination, where we see domination almost, I've listened all afternoon and it looks to me as if there's nothing but domination. And so I just, again, even on the institutions that were mentioned, the ESM, the EEAS as illicit institution, the word illicit means is illegal in some way. And these are not illegal institutions. They are extra treaty institutions, but they're locked into core regimes within the treaties themselves. So again, I just think there's a danger that we see domination everywhere in the discussion.
Thank you very much. So I would like to ask panel in the order of sitting from me to panel participants to answer to the questions that were posed to all of you and also individually. Basically, did we create two monsters?
Oh, well, very, very briefly. I mean, I completely agree with this because I think that, when I was speaking about this case, I started with asymmetry, which is a fact. But whether it was a dominance, well, that depends how you look at it. I think that if this is a club and someone is knocking at the door and applies, then of course someone has to set the conditions, and this is the case. So it was interesting to me how was this situation justified by the applicants, and of course that's I think the main different ways, and they make perfect sense. So I don't have a feeling that there was a clear case of dominance. It was asymmetry. There was an uneven balance of power, clearly, but this was accepted by both sides, and because it was dynamic and was changing, the idea was that it's not going to remain this way forever, but in the process there will be less asymmetry as and of course this asymmetry, to be honest, there was very often to the advantage of the applicants, because for instance in economic competition they enjoyed certain privileges which otherwise, if equal terms should be implied, they wouldn't be able to cope with. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I guess we always have to make a very clear distinction between domination and unjustified domination, right? I mean, if we're getting together as equal citizens to make laws that are binding on ourselves, that's a form of domination, right? I think somebody told me some time ago that hair shaft, all of the Germans in the room will have to tell me whether I'm wrong on this. The idea of hair shaft is different from the idea of violence. The idea of the right to govern and the right to make collective decisions, right? Is that, maybe somebody's completely misleading me in that case. Anyway, on John Eric, on unintended consequences. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the problem with agency, which Stephen mentioned this morning there, isn't there? That unintended consequences are perhaps not domination because there's no agent who is dominating. But maybe what we need is some kind of equal and justified process for reversing and challenging unintended consequences. It may be there is no agent who has brought those unintended consequences about, but perhaps we need to have, we have some kind of a right to want to undo things that have just consequences which is just accumulated in an unintended and random way. And that process would be one in which there has to be the right, fair and equal procedures for reversing any unintended consequences.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the unintended consequences thing is very interesting because, of course, I think you could ask, does dominance have to be intended? The answer is obviously no. So therefore, the question is when you trace things backwards to a point where you can in a kind of historical institutionalist way you can see a point of origin, then to what extent do you blame that point of origin for the consequences that follow? And of course the danger then is that you read backwards from the present and find dominance where perhaps there was no dominance. And I guess the case of obviously Greece was subject to dominance during the Eurozone crisis. If you then go back and look at the terms of Greek accession and the politics of Greek accession in the late 70s, early to 1980, then you can maybe overread dominance into those accessions. That's always a risk, of course. On unintended consequences, I think from our point of view, the interesting point there is that you can find quite benign and quite well-meaning principles in liberal thought, non-majoritarian protection. The idea of transparent numerical rules, these are not exactly things that on the face of it are malevolent, but if they're subject to epistemic capture, then of course they can be the source of dominance at some point in the future. So I guess the temporality of this is very, very interesting.
Thanks very much. I'll address two things. One is the unintended consequences as well. Now, if you look at, and I think John Eric is right, of course, there could be unintended consequences of well-meaning actions in reform processes. Think about the Renewal and Resilience Facility, the way it was set up, and the Renewal and Resilience plans. Now, if you look at the actual functioning of these processes in countries, and this is what the Slovak case study shows that I have in the book, is that you have various kinds of reforms bundled into tranches of money that will be then sent into the country. So you have to build so and so many kilometers of bicycle roads, have a university system reform, have a Green Deal set of reforms, and at the same time build 10 new hospitals in a very short time frame. Now, there is no time to discuss anymore, so the effect of this is then, of course, given that they're bundled, and unless you fulfill all the reform deliverables on time, what happens is that you then will lose the tranches of money that are being sent. So that is the challenge here. It's not an intended consequence. It's not an intended attempt to dominate. It is an attempt to provide support for reforms, but the mechanisms of how it actually works generate dominance because these processes are then taken out of the ordinary realm of politics into the technocratic realm of implementation, and that's because of the time constraints. Now, the second point I wanted to address and come back to the question that Bridget has raised about these new institutions such as the European Stability Mechanism, and this sort of goes back to a discussion we started in Pittsburgh some 2 weeks ago. So it continues. Now, of course, it is clear that the ESM is an international organization that's outside the treaty framework, but it is, as absolutely, I agree with you, Bridget, that this is indeed in the, very much connected with the legal framework. So, but I think there's a difference between legal frameworks and the actual practices in the way it operates. And in those practices, you do have a lot of dominance effects, illicit exclusion of countries. So think about, Sweden, Denmark, Czech Republic, Poland, all those countries that cannot participate in decision making at all. They are simply informed about decisions. Well, they're not in the euro, but these decisions have a very clear bearing upon their, fiscal policies, nevertheless. So, and these decisions happen out behind closed doors anyway, between the 19 ministers of finance of the eurozone. So that's the kind of effects I'm talking about in practice. In legal terms, of course, I mean there is a lot of alignment with the EU legal framework, but the practices of how actually decisions happen, that's a different story. So exclusion is part of the game.
Yes, I hear the criticisms about, or the concerns about the concept of dominance or domination. We've talked about this also in the past, that there is a danger of overstretching, of course, and political relations there's a lot of asymmetry, and if I can address just the question, is conditionality a form of dominance? I think this was, Sergio, what you, why should we see it like this? Not in and of itself. I mean, dominance, we have distinguished it as an arbitrary form of power, both procedurally, both as a structural condition and based on perceptions that are formed. So, conditionality, enlargement accession is by definition asymmetric, but not by definition arbitrary. That's why we've used the term voluntary, self-incurred voluntary submission. So domination emerges under certain conditions, and it's an outcome of a process of interaction that produces this effect, a kind of relationship that is no longer seen as legitimate, or is no longer seen as what's the word, mutual, reciprocal, and accepted. So I think this is the challenge to distinguish the concept of dominance from more ordinary relationships of power that are asymmetric. And it is an unintended effect. If we think of the EU, of course, in the context of enlargement, there is not a single agent. The EU is not a single agent. There is many agents under this who whose actions are consequential, and so it's largely an unintended effect.
Thank you very much, and Cecile.
Thank you. Regarding the concept of differentiation, and the stretching of this concept, I hope I have proven that I have actually de-stretched it in the context of comparative regionalism, because the concept was really stretched so that to include non-regional organization into the discussion of differentiation, and also in an attempt to legitimize differentiation in the EU, and to describe it as not a pathological feature because it was also used elsewhere. So I have tried really to have a very strict definition of differentiation in order to be able to have this comparative approach. I also I have dealt with conditionalities as well, and I'm in the context of the EU also a bit surprised of how conditionalities are described as a legitimate imposition of norms. And we discussed that, and there's much emphasis on the rights. We have heard that, and I think rights also come with duties. And in order to assess the effects of conditionalities in different all aspects, I think it's important to look into the costs and the benefits of conditionalities in a partnership. For example, we're talking about the Copenhagen criteria. Are they a form of domination? Well, Serbia has developed huge propaganda against the EU, whereas Serbia is a candidate country. And there has been also a lot of military cooperation in Serbia with China. So the fact that candidate countries have to align with the EU foreign policy, I would not call that a form of domination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that there are additional questions, but we are running a little bit out of time for this session. But please stay in, because the next session will actually discuss the same issues with slightly different set of empirical data, but we will still keep discussion between dominance to differentiation and back. So 10 minutes break, and please reconvene here. And I'm sorry for those who wanted to ask questions but had no time. So please keep those questions in mind. Thank you very much.